Masechet Gittin, Daf Mem Tet. We began the fifth perek yesterday with the statement that someone who causes damage, that's the mazik, has to pay back with the best of his land, idit, because of tikkun ha'olam, that will discourage people from going and causing damage if they know that they're going to have to give up their best land. Gemara asks, why is this called Tikkun Ha'olam, which suggests that it's a rabbinic enactment, if the pasuk itself says that someone who causes damage has to pay from the best of his land? So this is already a deoraita law. We already saw one answer to this question, that this is the opinion of Rabbi Ishmael. We're going to see another answer by Ravina in a few minutes that says the Mishnah can even be Rabbi Akiva. We'd prefer the Mishnah be like Rabbi Akiva. But now we're focusing on the first answer. Rabbi Ishmael says, actually, on a Doraita level, Metav Sadehu is referring to the best land of the Nizak, of the victim. And the rabbinic takana is that if the Mazik has better land, then the Mazik has to pay his best land to discourage him, even though from the letter of the law Doraita, he only has to pay the best land of the Nizak, assuming that the best land of the Nizak is lower than the best land of the Mazik. And so this follows Rabbi Ishmael. Now we know their opinions from this Braita that says explicitly, quotes the pasuk and says, Rabbi Ishmael says Nizak. The Braita also quotes the opinion of Rabbi Akiva, but the wording of Rabbi Akiva in this Braita, we're going to see another Braita in a few minutes where Rabbi Akiva is much clearer, but in this Braita, he doesn't actually say that you give the best land of the Mazik. He just says these kind of cryptic words, Lo baha katuv ela ligbot lanizakin min ha'idit. So it seems like he's arguing about something about how to read the pasuk, and the pasuk says you have to pay the best, and therefore kal vachomer lahekdesh, some kind of kal vachomer, that a payment for to hekdesh has to also be idit. And so that's what we're going to handle. We're going to unpack Rabbi Akiva's opinion in this Braita first, and then we'll go on to the second answer about the authorship of the Mishnah. Okay, so we're up to this. My Tamad Rabbi Ishmael. How is Rabbi Ishmael explaining the pasuk? Ne'emra sadeh lematav v'ne'emra sadeh lema'ala. Ma sadeh amora lema'ala denizak, af sadeh amora lemata denizak. Rabbi Ishmael says here, look at the pasuk. It says the word sadeh twice. It says in the beginning, ki yav'er ish sadeh o cherem v'shilachet be'iro u'bi'er bisteh acher. If someone causes damage to the sadeh, the field of someone else. So obviously the sadeh in the beginning of the pasuk is referring to the field of the nizak. Then he has to pay, the mazik has to pay metav sadehu, the best of his field. So the field in the beginning is referring to that of the nizak, and therefore the sadeh at the end is also referring to the nizak, to the victim. So the best of the victim's field, that's what the mazik has to pay. But if the mazik has even better land, he doesn't have to pay his better land. So this is that's how the Rabbi Ishmael is explaining this pasuk. Okay, Rabbi Akiva savar metav sadehu yeshalem teha'ich deka meshalem. Rabbi Akiva says sadehu, the pronoun on that word, his field, is referring to the verb of the sentence of that phrase, and that's the payer, the best of the payer's land. That's the mazik. And so that's how Rabbi Akiva explains the pasuk, even though it says sadeh twice, but the first sadeh is referring to the nizak, the second sadeh is his sadeh, the payer. That also makes sense. Okay, so both have good syntactical readings of the pasuk. Pronouns are difficult in that way. Rabbi Ishmael. Now, Rabbi Ishmael, what is he going to do? Because Rabbi Akiva has a good point. It's really hard to say, Metav Sedehu sounds like the one paying. Rabbi Ishmael, do you totally ignore that? Rabbi Ishmael says, no, I take that into account also. Ahani Gezerah Shava, Ve'ahani Kera. Right? The Gezerah Shava, that's Sadeh in the beginning and Sadeh at the end, that teaches me something. And the straightforward meaning of the pronoun, meaning going to the subject of the verb, also means something. How so? The Gezerah Shava is, as we said, that you assess the value of the nizak of the victim's land, the best of his land. Ani kerad it lela mazik idit viziburit ide la shavya ki idit de nizak dim shalem le mimetav. And the straightforward reading is going to help us in a case where the best land, the mazik has good land and low level land. However, the ziburit, the lowest level land of the mazik, is not as good as the best level of the nizak. And so in that case, we're going to assess, well, in that case, the mazik can't pay the lowest level land. See, beforehand we were assuming that it was talking about a case where the mazik's lowest land is better than the nizak's best land. And in that case, the mazik only has to pay his lowest land. But if not, if the mazik doesn't have his lowest land is worse, then the mazik cannot pay his lowest land. He'll have to find something better. Let's say he has only two levels of land, bad and good. So then the mazik will have to pay his best land, because the mazik's worst land is not as good as the nizak's best land. So there is in fact a case where the mazik would have to pay his best land, and therefore that's the straightforward reading. Says, listen, yeah, the sadeh is the level of has to be at least the level of the nizak. That's the minimum. But now we're also going to look at the different levels of land that the mazik has to make sure that whatever he's paying has to be at same or better than the best land of the nizak, and that's why the pronoun is of sadehu is also referring to the best land of the mazik, which he will have to pay in that case. Okay, good. Now that we know their sources, Rabbi Akiva omer lo ba'katuv ela ligbot lenizakin min ha'idit v'kal v'chomer lahekdesh. Rabbi Akiva in his statement says something about the pasuk is teaching us he has to pay the best, and the kal v'chomer that won't have to pay idit to hekdesh. What is this kal v'chomer? What case is it talking about? My kal v'chomer lahekdesh. Ilema dinagche Torah didan leTorah dehekdesh. Shore'ahu amadachamana velo shor shel hekdesh. If it's talking about a case where my unconsecrated regular ox gores a consecrated ox, a holy ox that someone donated to the Bet HaMikdash, it's owned by the Bet HaMikdash, and that's the case we're talking about, that I have to pay from my best. Well, that's not true, because the pasuk says shora aihu. This law of having to pay damages only applies when two regular people, my regular ox gores your regular ox. But if it's a consecrated ox, this whole law does not apply, right? And damages are not collected by the Bet HaMikdash, and so it can't be talking about that case. Rather, we're not talking about damages, we're talking about where I owe money. I donated 100 dinar to the Bet HaMikdash. I made a vow, and now I have no cash. So the treasurer is going to come and says, you donated, I'm going to collect from your land. What kind of land do I pay? Idit. That's what it's talking about. Not damages, but rather a monetary obligation. But that doesn't make sense either. Lo yehe ela ba'al chov, or ba'al chov dino bebenonit. That doesn't make sense, because that's the same as a loan. It's a monetary obligation. And we already saw in the Mishnah that monetary obligations are paid with medium quality land. Shouldn't be idit. Maybe you'll say, oh, according to the Mishnah was a different opinion. Rabbi Akiva thinks that someone who pays back a monetary obligation is always idit, and therefore that's the same true in all cases, and the same true for paying something to the Bet HaMikdash. But that can't be right either. You wouldn't have a kal v'chomer, because if in a case of damages, one would not pay anything to the Bet HaMikdash, so then you couldn't make a kal v'chomer, right? The kal v'chomer would only work if to say, oh, if for damages I have to pay the best amount, and here now we're saying, according to Rabbi Akiva, for a loan also I have to pay from idit, from the best of the field. So then I could say all the more so for hekdesh, because hekdesh is more important. But the power to collect from idit only works in damages to another person, not to the Bet HaMikdash. So if I don't pay anything to the Bet HaMikdash for damages, then then there's no Kal Vachomer to say all the more so I have to pay a monetary obligation from the best, right? Because we already saw that obligation to Hekdesh is lower than obligation to a regular person. I know it's paradoxical. You would think Hekdesh is better, but the Pasuk said, we already learned from the Pasuk that De'ehu, damages are only to another person, and therefore that removes the basis to say that you have to say a Kal Vachomer that the obligation to Hekdesh for a monetary obligation is going to be even more. Maybe not. Okay, so we're still stuck. Where is this Kal Vachomer of Rabbi Akiva? What case is it talking about? Okay, we're going to go back to the original hypothesis. Le'olam t'nachet Torah didan leTorah dehekdesh. It is when my regular ox gores a holy ox. Rabbi Akiva sabar la Rabbi Shimon ben Menasya detanya. Rabbi Shimon ben Menasya omer shor shel hekdesh shenagach leshor shel hejot patur v'shel hejot shenagach leshor shel hekdesh ben tam ben moad meshalem nezek shalem. Could be that Rabbi Akiva agrees with the opinion of Rabbi Shimon ben Menasya in the following Braita, where Rabbi Shimon ben Menasya says that if a holy ox gores my regular ox, the temple does not have to pay. Bet HaMikdash doesn't have to pay. That's what we learned from Shor De'ehu, that you only a regular person has to pay for damages. The Bet HaMikdash does not have to pay for damages. But the other way around, if my regular ox goes and gores a holy ox, then not only do I have to pay, it's even more stringent, even if my ox is just tam, in which case I would have to pay less to a regular person. I have to pay full amount to the Bet HaMikdash. And so, according to the Shimon ben Menasya, in fact, there is an obligation for me to pay the Bet HaMikdash, and that's what Rabbi Akiva was saying, that if you have to pay with idit, when I cause damages to a regular person, a regular ox, I have to pay with my best land. All the more so for if I cause damages to a holy ox, I have to pay with my best land. All right, now that makes sense. Now we have an answer to explain Rabbi Akiva's Kal Vachomer. But now, once we say this, now we can go back to the drawing board and wonder, wait a second, what was Rabbi Akiva saying all the whole time? If so, if Rabbi Akiva agrees with Rabbi Shimon ben Menasya, then how do you know that the machloket to begin with between Rabbi Ishmael and Rabbi Akiva was that Rabbi Ishmael says you have to pay the best of the nizak, and Rabbi Akiva said the best of the mazik? Remember, Rabbi Akiva, in that Baraita we just quoted, does not actually say that explicitly. So maybe he's arguing about something else. Dilma dekula ama bedinizak shaminan, vecha befluktad Rabbi Shimon ben Menasya v'rabanan kami palge. Maybe, in fact, everybody agrees with what Rabbi Ishmael said, that you pay the best land of the nizak, and Rabbi Akiva is only coming to argue to say that I agree with you that when it comes to that one pays the best value of the nizak, I'm coming to argue to Rabbi Akiva to say I agree also with Rabbi Shimon ben Menasya that if I cause damage to a holy ox, I also have to pay. And Rabbi Shimon said, no, you don't have to pay in that case. And that's where Rabbi Akiva came and said, I'm adding Kal Vachomer also to a holy ox. Maybe that's all they were arguing about, but they all said nizak. And if everybody says nizak, then even Rabbi Akiva could be the author of the Mishnah, because that would be the Doraita law, and then the rabbinic tikkun olam could be, even that of the mazik I have to pay, the best land of the mazik. Okay, so that's what we're going to try to say. The Rabbi Akiva sabar like Rabbi Shimon ben Menasya, Rabbi Ishmael sabar like Rabbanan. That's what Rabbi Akiva is saying. Yes, you have to pay for goring a holy ox, and Rabbi Ishmael said, no, you don't have to pay for a holy ox. That's their argument, but not about mazik and nizak's idit. Imken my lo bahakatuv. But that we disregard this possibility from three reasons. Number one, because in the Baraita, Rabbi Akiva said the pasuk only comes to teach, which sounds like he's arguing about how to read that pasuk. And now that makes sense. As we started, we saw that there's a machloket about how to read the pasuk. But if they're both reading the pasuk as the best of the victim of the nizak, then they're both reading it the same way. So then these words would have no meaning. Ve'od my kal vachomer lehekdesh. And also, what do you mean the kal vachomer? Right? How is it a kal vachomer? He's just saying that you have to pay. He agrees that you, in all cases, you pay the value of the best of the nizak. And so he's agreeing with that. So now the argument is only whether that applies also to the Bet HaMikdash or not to the Bet HaMikdash. Whereas in the regular reading, Rabbi Akiva is arguing on 2 points. That number one, I disagree with Rabbi Ishmael. You say mazik. I say you say the best of the nizak. I say, Rabbi Akiva says, the best of the mazik. And all the more so, if I damage something that is holy, I also have to pay my best value, right? Assuming it's higher. So there the kal vachomer makes sense. But if everyone agrees that you pay only the best of the nizak, then there's no kal vachomer and there's no way that hekdesh is not any more stringent than a regular person. Okay, ve'od ha'amar Rav Asher, Tanya behedya, metav sadeo metav kadmo yeshalem. Metav sadeo shel nizak, metav kadmo shel nizak, dibre Rabbi Ishmael. Rabbi Akiva omer, metav sadeo shel mazik, or metav kadmo shel mazik. We have an explicit braita, so really we don't have to go through this whole exercise, but it's fun to try to figure it out on our own. But truth is, we have an explicit braita that says, explains clearly the subject of their controversy. Rabbi Ishmael says the best of his land means the best land of the nizak, the best vineyard of the nizak, and Rabbi Akiva says no, one has to pay the highest value of whatever the mazik has, and the best vineyard that the mazik has, he has to pay. And that's the first thing that Rabbi Akiva disagrees about. You have to pay the best. And then he says, and furthermore, all the more so if you're paying for damages that you caused to hekdesh. And Rabbi Akiva does agree with Rabbi Shimon ben Asya that you do have to pay to hekdesh, and when you pay to hekdesh, all the more so you have to pay from the best of the perpetrator's land. Okay, all that was the first explanation of the Mishnah. Now we're going to have a second one. Ravina Amar, Leolam matnitin Rabbi Akiva hi damar midoraita b'demazik shaminan. Rather, second answer, the Mishnah is in fact the opinion of Rabbi Akiva, who says that on the doraita level, we assess damages that the perpetrator has to pay the best of his own land. And that's already the doraita law. So now the question is, why does the Mishnah say that sounds like it's only a derabanan if that's already the right law. Rabbi Shimon, he is also the opinion of Rabbi Shimon. Rabbi Shimon Bar Yochai was the student of Rabbi Akiva, and so this is in agreement with his teacher. And he says that darish ta'amad ikra umatam ka'amad matam hanizakin shamin lahem beidit mipnei tikun ha'olam. Rabbi Shimon is willing to expound the reasons for the Pesukim, the reasons for the mitzvot, and he uses that as a basis for explaining and defining what the law is. That's Rabbi Shimon says that in many other cases. And so here the Mishnah is actually not saying a rabbinic law, but rather a doraita law, and it's explaining the reason. Other sages say, we don't know what the reasons for mitzvot are. Rabbi Shimon says, we can explain the reason, and one should explain the reason, because if you know the reason, then you can fulfill it more precisely and more definitely. So the Mishnah is basically explaining itself. What is the reason that the Torah itself says that what the perpetrator has to pay with his own best land? The Torah wants the betterment of the world. The Torah itself already wants to make sure that people aren't going to go and cause damage and on purpose. And no, it's okay, I'll pay from my worst land. No, we want to make sure that people will have a deterrent and say, oh, if I cause a damage, I'm going to have to pay for my best land. I don't want to give up my best land. It's not a rabbinic enactment. It's a Torah law, and the Torah cares about the betterment of the world. Good. How do we see that? Tanya. Amar Rabbi Shimon, we have a braita where Rabbi Shimon says this. How come they say, and the braita, this is also in the Tosefta, it says they say, which sounds like the sages said it, but we're saying that According to the Bishimon, it's actually the Torah itself that says it. So how come the perpetrator has to pay with his own best? Mipnei gazlanim, mipnei hamsanim, kedesh sheyomar adam. למה אני גוזל ולמה אני חומס? למחר בית דין יורדין לנכסי ונוטלין שדה נאה שלי וסומכים על מה שכתוב בתורה מיטב שדהו ומיטב כרמו ישלם. לפיכך אמרו הנזקין שמין להן בעידית. Because a person is going to say, you have a thug and says, he's thinking, I'm just going to rob and take something. But if he thinks that these robbers or these thugs that take things by force, see, these people, they don't care. They're just going to say, oh, that looks like a nice thing. I'm going to take it. Okay, I'll pay. So what? If I'll pay tomorrow. I'll pay double. I don't care. I'll just pay for my worst field. So the payment won't be a deterrent for them. It's like some people, they park at a hydrant. They don't care. They say, okay, so I'll pay the ticket. I'll pay for parking anyway, right? And so the fine is not a deterrent for them. So that's why, specifically for them, that kind of person will say, wait a second, if I go and steal this guy's car here, then tomorrow I'm going to be caught. Now, otherwise I wouldn't care, but now I do care because the Bet Din is going to take my best land. I don't want to give up my best land. That's really producing a lot. So you know what? All right, I won't steal it. So this is a better deterrent, and that's why it's mipnei tikun ha'olam. Okay, good. So that's the beginning of the Braita, and this explains Rabbi Shimon's reasoning and why this is tikun ha'olam. And we're reading this Braita as Rabbi Shimon saying that's the Torah itself's law. Once we quote the Braita, we're going to quote the entire Braita that explains the other items on the list as well. Mipnei ma amru ba'al chob benonit kedei shelo yir'eh adam lachavero sadeh na'a ve'dira na'a ve'yomar ekpotz ve'elvenu kedei she'egvenu bechobi lefichach amru ba'al chob benonit. How come to pay a loan I can only, when I want to collect, if you owe me money and you don't have money, I collect from your medium land. What's the reason for that? Why can't I collect from your best land? The reason is because, let's say, I see you have a very, very, very nice field, and I'd really like it. I am jealous of it, and I want to go and take it. So here's what I can do. I can go and offer you a loan with, a $1 million loan, right? And I say, come on, take the $1 million loan. And it really will be a setup, kind of like what banks were doing back when they were giving everyone a loan, even people who wouldn't be able to pay it back. So I'm going to give you $1 million loan, right? And you're like, okay, great, fine, I'll take $1 million. And then in the end, you won't be able to pay it back because you're going to, who knows what you're going to do with it. And then I will go and say, oh, you can't pay back $1 million. I'm going to take your best field. So I'm going to set you up for failure so that I can take your best field in order to protect the borrowers against that. That we have a tikkun ha'olam. The rabbi said, you know what? If you're going to collect land, you can only collect from the middle one. That way, I'm not going to set you up for failure so that I can collect your best land. Okay, hold on. If that's the reason, why not go even lower and say that the lender can only collect from the lowest level land, right? So to totally protect the borrower so that I won't even take his middle valuable land. No, that's too much to the other side, whereas everything's a balance, because then I'm not going to want to give you a loan. If you come and you say, hey, can you give me a loan? And I know if you don't pay up, I'm only going to collect this marshland that you have out in Kansas, right? This low-level land. I'm going to say, you know what? That's what I'm going to collect. If you can't pay, that's not worth it. And I'm not going to lend you money. And that's not good, because then borrowers will not be able to borrow money, and that's not good for the economy. So we want it to be land that's good enough that will incentivize lenders to give money, but not so good that will incentivize lenders to overlend, and such that the borrowers can't pay, and then the borrowers will lose out on their best land. Good. Ketubah isha beziburit divrei Rabbi Yehuda, Rabbi Meir omer bebenonit. The woman collects her ketubah from the lowest level land of the husband, according to Rabbi Yehuda. Rabbi Meir says no, she can collect from the middle middle value land. Amar Rabbi Shimon, mipnei ma amru ketubat isha beziburit. So Rabbi Shimon explains what's the reason according to Rabbi Yehuda, that she collects from the lowest value. Sheyoter mima she'ish roseh lisa ha'isha rosa linaseh. Because more than a man wants to get married, a woman really wants to get married, and therefore we want to encourage men to get married in the first place. And so we tell a husband, listen, if you get married, you have to pay ketubah. I'm going to have to pay ketubah at the end. He might be wary of entering into such an agreement. He's making himself liable. He says, okay, but you only have to pay from the lowest level land. He says, only lowest level land? Okay, then I will get married. And a woman will agree to that, because women, it's more difficult for them to find men than it is for men to find women. And so the woman will agree to that. She has to get a ketubah. She has to get something. But we want to make it easier for men to pay the ketubah and therefore be willing to enter into marriage. And that helps out women, because women really want to get married, and that way it'll make it easier for women to find men willing to enter into marriage. Davar acher, isha yosa lirsona v'shelo lirsona v'ish eno mosi'a ela lirsono. Or another explanation, a woman leaves the marriage based on her will or even against her will, where a man can only gives and leaves the marriage according to his will. In other words, a get has to be given by a man willingly. You can't force a man to give a get. If he wants to, he gives it. If he doesn't want to, he doesn't give it. That gives the man leverage over his wife, because he has full power to give a get. On the other hand, a woman, she can get divorced even against her will. If a husband gives her a get, she has no say in the matter. Unlike entering marriage, where the woman has to agree to it, leaving marriage, the woman does not have to agree to it. So she has less power in that sense. Okay, so this is presented as a reason why why it should be ziburit, but the Gemara is confused by this, because it doesn't seem to explain why should that mean it's ziburit. So my davar acher, what is this alternate reason? Takinu la rabanan ketubah mineh, ki nafka ihi name litakne le rabanan ketubah mina. Tashema isha yos'ad lirsona v'shelo lirsona v'ish eno mosi ela lirsono efshar demashe la begita. In fact, the davar acher is not an alternate explanation why the woman should get the lowest level land for her ketubah, but it's a further discussion, follow-up discussion. So we understand that the husband has to give a ketubah in order to protect the interests of the woman. So it shouldn't be too easy for him to give her a get, and so he will have to think twice. We want him to think twice, but we don't want him to think 3 times and 4 times. That's why we don't tell him you're going to have to pay from the best of your land. You can pay from the cheapest land, and that way he will be willing to enter into the marriage, but still she will be protected. And so as a follow-up to that, we say, wait a second, why don't we institute that? Just like when he initiates a divorce, the rabbis said that he has to pay a ketubah so that he will not divorce her too easily, too quickly. So too, why don't we say reciprocal law, that when she initiates a divorce, then she should have to pay him a ketubah amount, so that she will not divorce him too quickly if she has to pay. And she'll say, maybe she'll think twice also and say, maybe we should do some therapy, maybe we could make up, before jumping the gun and just getting divorced. So whoever wants to initiate the divorce, that person should have to pay. Why should it be that he pays her in all cases? So if you ask that question, that's why we have this davar acher, that the woman gets out of the marriage whether she's willing to or not, whereas a man, he is always willing, because he has the sole right to give the get whenever he pleases. The husband cannot be forced, but the wife can be forced. Therefore, already built into that law, that gives the husband more power because he can initiate, she cannot initiate. And therefore, to counterbalance, she gets a ketubah, she doesn't have to give a ketubah. And that way, they'll have a proper balance. He knows that he can always give her a get, but if he does, he'll have to pay a ketubah. So he's going to have to. He'll make sure to do everything else that possible to fix the marriage. And then, if it's really can't get out of it, okay, then he'll give her a get and pay the ketubah. And on the other side, she knows that the husband can withhold the get, and so she's gonna do everything possible to fix the marriage, because that's the difficulty on her side of getting out of it. So that she will not be inclined to just be annoying to him, just to instigate him to give to divorce, because she knows that he has the power to withhold, and then that will prevent her from getting married. And so that's the check. She already has a check on her. She doesn't need a further check that she would have to pay him. So this is the balance that the rabbis gave. Apparently this balance worked in those days. Perhaps in our days, because the ketubah amount is relatively small, because it's not the main financial agreement anymore. So therefore, that shifted the balance. The man still has in halakha the sole right to give the get, and the amount that the woman gets in the ketubah is relatively small. So perhaps that's a reason why we have a bigger aguna problem than they had back in Talmudic times. Okay, ketubat isha beziburit. Now, going on to the next clause of the Mishnah. A woman gets paid with the lowest quality land, which we already just happened to be talking about, because we were analyzing the continuation of that baraita, so we already have an introduction to the reason why. Amar mozutra bered Rav Nachman la amaran ela miyatme avam mine dide bebenonit. Mozutra qualifies the Mishnah and says, this is only true that she gets from the lowest quality land when her husband died and the sons inherit, and she is collecting from the orphans. That's why she collects from the lowest quality. That's true for all. In any case, whenever someone is collecting money from orphans, the orphans only have to give up on the lowest quality land. However, in the case where the husband did not die, but rather they are divorced, that's the two cases where she would collect her ketubah, either death of the husband or divorce. If they get divorced and the husband's still alive and the husband himself is paying mineh dideh, then he has to pay benonit, medium quality land. So that's mozutra. That's giving her a little bit more than what we would think from the Mishnah. According to the Mishnah, whether he pays or the orphans pay, it's always ziburit. According to Mozutra, no, she gets benonit. Only the difference is that when the orphans pay, so anytime orphans pay, they pay from the lowest quality. But if he's paying, okay, make him pay from the benonit. That's Mozutra's opinion. Now we're going to challenge it from a few different sources. Miyatme ma'iria ketuvat isha afilu kol mile name dehatinan enifra min nexeyotum ela min haziburit ela lav mine. Mozutra assumed that the line in the Mishnah that says Ketubat Isha Beziburit was talking only about if orphans are paying. But if that's true, then why would you even have to mention this clause at all? Because in fact, anything that orphans pay, they only pay from Ziburit, as it says in the continuation of the Mishnah, that Yatumim only pay from the lowest quality land. And therefore, this whole phrase would be is unnecessary, according to you, right? You wouldn't have to say it at all if it's the orphans paying. So rather, the wisest clause here must be because it's talking about not the orphans paying, but the husband himself paying, and teaching us that when the husband himself pays, he pays ziburit. And that goes against you, Morzutra, when you said that the husband himself, if he's alive, pays benonit. How are you going to answer that? He answers, Le'olam miyatme. Uchtubat isha istiricha le, sakadatach amina mishum china, akilu rabanan gaba, kamash malan. No, this clause in the Mishnah is in fact talking about orphans paying, and has to say it anyway, even though orphans always pay ziburit. You have to say it again regarding Ketubat Isha, because otherwise I might have thought that for the sake of the desirability of this widow, maybe the rabbi rabbis were benefited her and were lenient towards her and said, listen, orphans have to pay ziburit in all other cases, but for a ketubah, because the woman needs to be more desirable to get remarried. It's easier for a woman to get remarried if she has higher quality land rather than lower quality land. So maybe here we would think that the rabbis made an exception, and that's why the Mishnah has to go out of its way to say not only do orphans pay ziburit in all cases, that's even true in a ketubah. So that Mozutra can read our Mishnah just fine. Okay, another challenge to Mozutra. Amar Rava, Tashma, Rabbi Meir omer ketuvat isha bebenonit. Here, Rava has a braita quoting Rabbi Meir, a minority opinion, saying that ketubah of a woman is paid with medium quality land. Now that actually agrees with Mozutra, but therein is the problem. This is a minority opinion. Right? So let's see first what cases Rabbi Meir is talking about. Miman, who is paying? If it's talking about the orphans paying, Rabbi Meir certainly, doesn't he agree with the basic Mishnah that orphans only pay from ziburit? So it can't be that the orphans are paying, elalav mineh. Rather, Rabbi Meir must be talking about a case where the husband is paying, and Rabbi Meir thinks that the husband pays bebenonit, which is what Mozutra says. But he's a minority opinion. That means that the other rabbis who disagree with Rabbi Meir think that a husband himself also pays ziburit, and Mozutra should follow the majority opinion, not the minority opinion of Rabbi Meir. So how are we going to answer that? Lo le'olam miyatme v'shane ketubat isha mishum china. In fact, we're talking about where the orphans are paying, according to the Rabbi Meir. And the Rabbi Meir is saying when the orphans pay, they should pay benonit to the wife. And even though in general, you're right, orphans pay ziburit, but in this case, according to the Rabbi Meir, it's not just the havamina. The havamina in the previous answer is the reality in this answer, that according to the Rabbi Meir, the rabbi said, listen, orphans, even though you usually only pay ziburit, but for this widow, we want her to have higher quality so that she'll be more desirable, and therefore you have to pay benonit. But really, the Rabbi Meir is only talking about orphans, and the rabbis disagree, and they say about orphans paying, no, only ziburit. But they weren't talking about, there was no argument between the Rabbi Meir and the rabbis regarding a husband, and so there's no contradiction here. Regarding a husband, it could be that, in fact, everybody would agree with Mozutra that the husband pays benonit, and so there's no challenge from this source. Okay, another challenge. Amar Abaye Tashma. Hanizakin shamin lahen be'idit uba'alcho bebenonit uchtubat isha beziburit. This challenge is from our very Mishnah that brought the three levels. Damages as highest level, paying alone is medium, ketubah is ziburit. Miman, now who's paying? Ilema miyatme, my idiot ketubat isha, afilu kol hane name, elalav mine. Who's paying in each of these cases? If it's orphans of all the people that are responsible, then why is it only Ketubah Isha that's Ziburit, or everything on the list should be from Ziburit? In other words, if someone caused damage and then died and the orphans are paying, they pay Ziburit. If someone owed money and died and the orphans are paying, Ziburit. And Ketubah also Ziburit. So if it's the orphans paying, we're assuming that it's the same person paying in all three cases. So if it's the orphans paying, then all of them would be ziburit. So you could see here that in none of the cases is it the orphans paying, but rather who's paying? Elalab mineh, the person himself, the person who caused damage, the person who owed money, or the husband himself after divorce. And it says ziburit, not benonit, challenge to morzutra. Okay, how's he going to solve this one? Amarav aha bar Yaakov. Hacha b'ma'askinan kegon shena'asa arev leniske beno lebalcho beno v'dichtubat kalato. So kind of you have to read a lot into the Mishnah here, but a brilliant answer that actually all three cases are not talking about where the person, the litigant himself, is paying, not his son either because he died, but rather the father. We're talking about a case where the father made himself a guarantor for his son, and in the first case he made himself a guarantor for any damage that his son does. And so, in that case, just like the son, if he were alive, would have to pay the best, the father, who's a guarantor, has to pay the best. In the second case, the father agrees to be a guarantor for his son's loan. And just like if the son were alive and defaulted on the loan, he would give medium quality. So to the father gives medium quality. And the same in the last case, the father made himself a guarantor to the son to pay the ketubah, and then the son could not pay. And so the father pays, just like the father pays in that case, ziburit. Even though if the son were alive, the son would pay benonit, because we're following Mor Zutra here. Nevertheless, the father, even though the son would pay benonit, the father pays ziburit. Why? Because each one follows its own law. Someone who causes damage or someone who owes money, that if they were alive, they would pay the highest or middle level. So the father also follows the same thing and pays what the son would pay were he alive, the highest idit or benonit for nizakin and for a loan. However, ketubat isha lachar mitar gavya, the vast majority of ketubot are paid after someone dies. Divorce is relatively rare compared to dying. Right? Not in America. In America, 50% of marriages end in divorce. But in traditional societies, more people die than get divorced, and therefore generally it's the orphans, not the person himself who is paying. Therefore, usually, who's paying the ketubah? Miatmeh. It's the orphans. Therefore, the father, it's not the orphans paying, but the father paying. The father pays as if the same amount, the same type of payment that the orphans would pay, which is ziburit. And so that explains why this explains the Mishnah, that the Mishnah is not talking about the husband himself paying, in which case it would be benonit for ketubah. It's not talking about orphans paying, in which case all things would be ziburit, but rather it's talking about the father paying, and this is why the father pays the regular amount for the first two, but ziburit for the third one. Okay, now we challenge this answer. V'tepukle de'arev diktubah la mishta'abed. Wait a second. We have a rule that a guarantor for a ketubah does not obligate himself. We're going to get into this more on the next daf, but the basic idea is that if you're writing a ketubah, and then, there's some question. The bride says, wait, I want a guarantor to pay the ketubah. And I come as a friend. Maybe I'm a friend of both, all the families here. And says, okay, I'll guarantee the ketubah. We assume that me as the guarantor, I'm not actually earnest about guaranteeing the ketubah. I just want to encourage you to get married. I want this to go through because, who else are you going to find? You make a good match. And so yeah, I'll guarantee it. I just say it, but I don't think I'm really going to have to, because I assume that you'll end up paying it at the end of the marriage. And so therefore, since we have a rule that a guarantor on a ketubah does not obligate himself, so then if the father comes and says, I guarantee the ketubah of my son, he's not actually guaranteeing it. He would not actually have to pay. So what are you going to say? What cases are talking about? And so we update it instead, and we say it's not a regular guarantor, but someone called a kablan, an unconditional guarantor. Just call him kablan. Kablan is someone who accepts upon himself to guarantee a loan or financial obligation, even if the borrower doesn't default on it. The borrower can come and say, hey, you pay, right? This would be a very close friend or partner, or more likely a father or a family member, right? That said, even if you can pay, right, you can take from me, and I will obligate myself to pay. And so even though in Arev, it does not, we don't assume is sincere, but a Kablan, who is giving more, we assume is sincere. So that's what I was talking about. We're talking about a father who accepts upon himself to be a Kablan on behalf of his son. Okay. We're assuming that this is a case where the son has no money. and so he can't pay himself. So the answer that you just said, that the father is acting as a kablan, that answer is acceptable according to the opinion. Again, we're going to see more discussion on this in the next daf. According to the opinion that even if the son, in this case the son or whoever is the borrower, has no money, the kablan will still obligate himself. But there's another opinion. The other opinion says that if the borrower has assets, then the kablan is sincere about it. Why? The kablan is sincere because he says, listen, he has assets, and so probably he will pay, and yet he's coming and asking me to guarantee it. Oh, see how honored I am that he's looking up to me as the guarantor. So yes, I'll obligate myself to pay. So he would. But in the second opinion, if the son or borrower has no assets, then the guarantor, the kablan, is not sincere about taking it upon himself to pay. What would you say in that case? Because here, since the son in this case does not have assets, and the father, as an arev for ketubah, is not sincere, and a kablan also, if the person doesn't have assets, is not sincere, then how are you going to explain this? And there have two answers. If we're talking about a case where the son did have assets, but he had some fields, but they became blighted, they became ruined, and so at the time he had assets, and so the father did in fact take upon himself that obligation. It's a serious obligation, and only afterwards he couldn't pay, so then the father steps in. Or some say that when it comes to a father and son, a father always obligates himself for his son. It's different from two business partners or friends. A father will accept the obligation to pay for his son, even if the son has no property of his own. And so we uphold that our Mishnah could be talking about a case not where the husband himself is paying, not where the orphans are paying, but rather where the father is paying on his behalf, and the father pays on his behalf as if it were him for the first two categories. But since Ketubah is usually paid by the Yotamim, and Yotamim is usually paid for, and Yotamim pays Ziburit, so the father, who obligated himself as a kablan, only pays the Ziburit. But this following Mor Zutra, in Mor Zutra's interpretation, if the husband himself would pay a ketubah, he would in fact have to pay the benonit. Baruch Adonai leolam, amen ve'amen.